of them. Some of them are from the region or have heritage in the region, but for the most part, if they grew up here, they don't know anything about it, which still strikes me as so bizarre, as that was, you know, the formative thing, as I am a sort of Gen Xer, grew up in the 80s and early 90s. So that's sort of the moment, and every generation has its moments. So it's always interesting to meet, you know, 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds now who are like, I've heard my grandparents mention this Cold War, but nobody could ever know what it is. So yeah, just trying to get them from a basic level to think about multiple causes and to think beyond, because it's so funny to me, even when they come in as undergrads and don't know much about anything about this country, they still have these Cold War tropes somewhere embedded in their North American DNA, and they assume, well, communism was doomed to fail, and those sorts of inevitability arguments will come out, even though we haven't talked anything about that even from, you know, the early part of the 20th century. So that's sort of interesting. So I spent a lot of time taking down assumptions. But beyond that, you know, looking at economic factors, obviously, but, you know, I was just going to come in here today and say, I know the right answer is certainly the economy and military spending and, you know, unrest with nationalities and whatnot. But what I try to do in classes and what I, you know, sort of come at history with is making a case for social change as well, and for those important cultural moments. So I show them, you know, Victor Tsoi and Kino videos, and I show them, you know, some other ways in which counterculture was important in the 80s and things like that. But it's tricky for undergrads to get beyond either, if it's multi-causal, then it seems like a laundry list to them, and they're like, well, what's the one right answer that they want to take away for what will be on the test? So I think it's nice for you folks to have this opportunity to think about the broader theory and how historians are trying to place this into the bigger picture, right? And looking at your reading list for today, you got quite a bit of different perspectives on it, which is neat.
Dennis, did you want to say something? No? Or Anastasia? I saw hands. I see people managing. Anyway, any sort of thoughts or comments on that? Maybe I'll just return to that in terms of thinking about how these Cold War tropes, and maybe we'll go a little bit past 1991 now. We had this discussion about do we use the word collapse of the Soviet Union? Do we use end of the Soviet Union, right? And actually, that's another interesting way to define it in terms of the way that in our imagination, there's a lot of the Soviet Union tropes that still exist, and this has been a constant. And I know, Erica, one of the sort of side projects you have is to look at these kinds of characters in North American movies, right, and things like that, and that it hasn't changed that significantly. And I think of these villains with these certain accents and things like that. I don't really know what the resource is from that, but the way that we understand this place as other, right?
Yeah.
Seems to have not changed. And I don't know when you were sort of starting to think about that movie project, how you thought about it.
Well, it's so persistent, and it goes before the 20th century, certainly, this Russia as other in European culture, and it's persisted after 91. It's so interesting. I'm sure most of, you folks are already familiar with that. But yeah, in addition to, I can dream up all sorts of new projects because I'm at the beginning stage of all of them. So I haven't decided which one to go after first yet. So hockey is one, and one is, Jeff's right, I'm interested in, just from watching, not a lot, but enough television over the past few years and movies, this sort of resurgence of the Russian character, Slavic character, not just as the villain, as they might have been in Cold War media, but in North America, but as like sort of the most extreme character, the funniest, the most eccentric, maybe the villain, or just like the comic relief, or the strongest, or just like what is going on with these depictions of the Slavic other in Canadian and American shows. There's some new Netflix Anastasia movie I was just looking at on Twitter, is apparently absolutely horrible, transposes Anastasia to 1986 New York or something. Is it Netflix or it's somewhere? Russianist Twitter is reviewing it and slandering it, but yeah, this persistence of the Russian other, it's interesting where it comes from. I mean, it's coming out of, and I'm not a political scientist, so you folks who deal more with current events and the current climate, it's certainly because of that. But it's interesting when undergraduates still come from this point of, you know, 1991 was, we're not really sure what happened, but it definitely collapsed and it was inevitable. I'm like, where did you come into the room with these assumptions? I haven't taught you anything like that when we talked about 1917. I think the word collapse is certainly something I try to dispel into either transformation or what other, just sort of to ask even undergraduate students, what other words might we use if we are looking at more continuities. But